just for a little bit of context, Shaka Zulu was the king of the Zulu tribe in South Africa. Now the Zulu people are a Bantu people, so just for a little bit of like further context, right? So the Bantu people came down to Southern Africa around 2,000 years ago, and they settled in South Africa in around 300 AD. And this is something known as the Bantu migration. So the native people in South Africa at the time were the Khoisan, and there still are some of them about today in certain regions of Southern Africa, but for the most part they were displaced by the Bantu people who came from mainly Western and Central Africa. So what we have to understand is that at the time, South Africa was made up of many different like tribes and stuff. There was no nation obviously called South Africa at the time, so there were just many different competing tribes. Now for the most part, before Shaka Zulu, warfare was done on relatively like ceremonial level. It was kind of, or if it was to be done on a larger scale, it was mainly just to do with like raiding like the next tribes, like sheep or cattle and stuff. So it wasn't in like an organized way with like big kind of battles and like tactics and all the rest of it. And so Shaka Zulu really revolutionized warfare in Southern Africa, which is partly why we're even doing this video in the first place, because if the Zulus were just like any other tribe in Africa, people outside of Africa would never have really heard of them. So it's because of how strong they were as warriors and like how fearsome they were and what tactics they had. That's the main reason why the Zulus are, for better or worse, so famous. And Shaka Zulu himself is credited with having two innovations here which revolutionized warfare in Southern Africa. One is the Ikwa. Like, I don't know how to pronounce it and stuff yet, but it's a short stabbing spear. So for the most part, people before just had like long spears that they would like hurl at the enemy from a great distance. However, this allowed for more close range combat, so you're able to get in close and like stab your opponent and stuff. So this weapon was something which you could actually take into battle, and it would be a lot more effective, than having just these spears and stuff by themselves. And then on top of that, you had another innovation of his, which was something known as the horn of the buffalo, right? Or as some people refer to it, the bull horn formation. So the idea of this is basically you have the chest, you have the horns, and you have the loins of the buffalo, right? So the chest are the senior veterans, so these are people who are like battle hardened and stuff. They're a little bit older, they kind of know what it's about, but they're not like as quick as some of the younger ones, right? So they make up the kind of like brunt of the formation, right? Then on the sides, on the flanks, you have the younger people, so the younger soldiers, the younger impies, right? They are obviously quicker, and so they're able to run much faster. So what they do is they fan out, and they basically encircle the enemy. So much like the kind of like blitzkrieg movement that you see with like the German panzers. Yeah, basically Shaka Zulu was blitzkrieg in many ways before there was blitzkrieg. So this kind of encircling movement, would completely surround the enemy. And then what would happen is that the chest would then close in. And anyone trying to escape that encirclement would then be swallowed up by the loins, and these are the people who would be in reserve, and they would go and just wipe out anyone who tried to flee. So with a combination of this, they were pretty indestructible. So even with them going up against like mechanized warfare with like, guns and everything, they were still highly effective. And actually they dealt some crushing defeats on both the British and the Boers when they eventually came up to them. But one thing that there is a lot of controversy about and a lot of debate is Shaka's involvement in the crushing, right? So some people say it was more complicated than that. Some people say that like the Zulus were largely to blame for it. But the crushing or the scattering, or I'm not going to say the native word for it, it's on screen now, I'm not going to try and pronounce that. So basically in this region of Southern Africa, you already had the Portuguese who were in Angola and Mozambique, and Mozambique is neighbouring South Africa. So many of these explorers and settlers brought with them maize. So this maize came from the Americas, and it was able to be grown out there as well. And with this maize / corn, it was able to be easily grown, and it was very nutritional for the natives. And this led to a sudden increase in the population. However, during this period, there was also a great number of droughts. And the fact that there was this excess population mixed with this shortage of food, this led to a lot of conflict between the different tribes, yeah, as they competed for the limited resources that were there. So out of the kind of chaos of this time, this is when the Zulus kind of rise to prominence. So many people attribute between 1 and 2 million people who are estimated to have died during this time. They attribute this to the Zulu people, and they attribute this mainly to Shaka Zulu. But historians are now debating that narrative. That was a kind of historic narrative that made it very Zulu-centric, but actually I think it's a bit more complicated than that. A lot of the kind of accounts of Shaka Zulu, because obviously the Zulus were like pre-literate people at that time, so they didn't really have any written records. So the only records we have were from European explorers who happened to come through, and obviously they were coming across many people who were fleeing the Zulus and were hearing all these stories about them. And then when they finally met Shaka and the Zulus, you know, many of them might have written it in a slightly biased way. So these are some of the things we have to kind of bear in mind, that oftentimes easy narratives in history are a little bit complex, and you have to actually dig a little bit deeper to get what might be the truth. But regardless of how involved he was during this period, I think that there was quite a lot of evidence to suggest that he played a pivotal part in it. And so what the Prussians ended up doing was basically scattering the different tribes, yeah, of that region into different areas. So the depopulation of this whole kind of region led to many different effects, yeah, led to people fleeing into neighbouring countries. And also this depopulation paved the way for the Afrikaners, yeah, to come in. So the Afrikaners people, they are the descendants of Dutch and other European settlers who settled around the town of Cape Town. So in 1806, the British, during the Napoleonic Wars, basically were a bit sneaky and they took that territory for themselves, right? And so basically what they did is then they started to impose British laws on them, such as the evil crime of abolishing slavery, right? So basically the Afrikaners who were living in the Cape were not very happy about the British saying that they couldn't own African slaves. And so many of them, not all of them, but many of them, got onto wagons and basically headed east, right? And further into the interior. And this trek is known as the Great Trek. As a matter of fact, we have that word now in English as a result of it coming from the Afrikaners, right? So basically, you know, it means like a long trip or a long like voyage. So yeah, so that's where we get the word trek from. And eventually they would set up the Orange Free State, and they would set up the Transvaal Republic. You know, and so these were the so-called Boer republics. So Boer is the Afrikaans word for a farmer. So, you know, these people were just basically farmers, but they went and set up different republics out in the interior of South Africa. But if this region hadn't been depopulated by the Zulus, yeah, and especially by the leadership of Shaka Zulu, then it's very questionable as to whether the Boers would have been able to have made it. Certainly some of them would have made it, but if they had to compete with far more people and far more tribes along the way, there's every chance that many more of them wouldn't have made it there than end up being the case, right? So that's something to kind of like bear in mind. And then also along this great trek, the Zulus were the most formidable force that the Boers had to face. And so there's a very famous battle which took place in 1838, known as the Battle of Blood River, in which the Boers were surrounded by the Zulus in this kind of Horn of the Buffalo formation. But what the Boers did is, because they had their wagons, they basically formed a defensive perimeter known as a flight commando. And basically this was a defensive circle which basically stopped the Zulus from being able to come in, and they were able to fire on the Zulus, yeah, as they were approaching. And this is how just 664 Afrikaans farmers were able to stand off against 10 to 15,000 Zulus, yeah. And the Zulus had a lot of casualties. The Boers just had 3 wounded and 0 deaths. You know, so for the first time, the bullhorn formation had kind of run up against an impregnable foe. But this wouldn't be the last time that the Zulus would come up against European settlers, and in future times they would be more successful than this. Now, a few decades after the Great Trek, the Boers in South Africa found gold and they found diamonds. So the British who were on the coast in Cape Colony decided we want a piece of that. And so what they did is they started to send up contingent forces into that region, right? Because eventually the plan was to overrun the Boer republics, as ended up happening at the end of the Second Boer War, which came many decades later. But in 1879, the Zulus were one of the tribes which were in the way of this kind of expansion. And so the British were very arrogant, and they expected, oh, well, yeah, we've got guns, we've got cannons, surely we will be able to defeat these natives, right? So at the Battle of Isluanda, you had 1,800 Brits versus 20,000 Zulus. So the Brits thought, right, we're outnumbered, but obviously we'll be able to deal with them. You know, they're just a bunch of savages, etc., right? What ended up happening is that over 1,300 of that 1,800 were completely wiped out. And again, it's because of this bullhorn formation in which the Zulus surrounded the Brits and then were able to basically crush them. And although obviously the Zulus lost between 1,000 and 3,000 men, the British contingency was almost completely wiped out. And the shock of this defeat made the British finally realise that the Zulus were not like many other tribes in Africa. They were not to be messed with, right? They were serious business, and it would require serious warfare to actually take them out. So what ended up happening is that the few surviving Brits who were there, some of them were able to flee to a safe point known as Rorke's Drift. So this was about 140 men, and they eventually ended up having to face off against between 2,000 and 3,000 Zulus. And again, you see this bullhorn formation surrounding the encampment, and after many, many hours of them fighting, somehow, by some miracle, the British were able to stave them off with just 17 casualties to the 351 Zulu casualties. You know, so it's not to say that mechanized warfare couldn't fight off against the Zulus, but it still came at a terrible price, yeah. So, you know, the much bigger defeat of Isluanda compared to this relatively minor defeat, this was something which sent shockwaves through the British Empire. And actually, you can see this in the film Zulu, and then also Zulu Dawn. So Zulu Dawn covers the Battle of Isluanda, and Zulu covers just Rorke's Drift. So definitely give those two films a watch. So although the Zulus were invaded and defeated, the British still held a great deal of respect for them. And so even to this day, the name Zulu connotes a warlike mentality and is highly respected within Britain and within the rest of the world. And the name Shaka Zulu reverberates throughout the ages.